We are in the technical breakout for this room. So this is the follow-on actual cool part of the talk that I gave before lunch with the dark wizard himself, Scott Goodwin. Like I was saying earlier, for those of you who haven't been in CS2 before, they used to be all main session presentations. So it would go technical presentation, executive presentation to the same audience throughout the day. And Scott's presentations back at CS2 Tampa several CS2s ago actually forced our hand to the point where we had to just make technical and executive breakouts, otherwise people would, their heads would explode. So this is actually he is the reason why we have technical breakouts. And so he's going to be talking about MITRE ATT&CK in terms of practical implementations. He's the expert, and away we go.
Introduction. This is my fourth CS2 presentation, and I really enjoy presenting at these conferences because we have a great community, and the community I've found it to be very receptive to the types of topics that I really like to talk about. And that topic has always been, here at CS2 at least, focusing on the CMMC requirements through a purely security-focused lens. So I'm not up here to talk or advise on compliance. There's a lot of other, really smart people here who are going to talk about compliance from a lot of different perspectives. Today, we're going to talk about security within the CMMC framework, and we're going to be kind of dovetailing in with Jacob's talk by bringing in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So I found myself with a really unique perspective on these requirements over the last several years or so, because I've had the privilege of helping a large number of organizations across the defense industrial base from two completely different ends of the information security spectrum. On the one hand, our company has helped lots of organizations develop and mature information security and compliance programs with respect to the CMMC requirements. But on the other hand, I also lead the ethical hacking or penetration testing practice at PKF O'Conner Davies. So we find ourselves performing penetration tests or ethical hacking exercise against very similar organizations, or sometimes those very same organizations. And in that context, we're up there to actively burn that information security program down. So from that perspective, I've come to a conclusion, I should say, and that conclusion is that we need to redefine vulnerability management. Because the organizations that I've been working with, or continue to work with, the most of them at least, their vulnerability management strategy focuses on the what, right? What is vulnerable in my environment? What patches do I need to apply to address those vulnerabilities? And from that perspective, we're doing the things that NIST 800-171 is telling us to do. If we look at the control requirements from that framework, we have controls that are telling us to do vulnerability scanning and to remediate the vulnerabilities that we find on those scans and to perform maintenance and conduct patching and things like that. But to address real-world threats, and from my perspective, a real-world threat is the types of things that we're executing on our penetration tests, we need to be focusing on the how. If you're focusing on the how of how your organization might actually be compromised, then the what follows naturally from that. So if you're NIST 800-171 and CMMC Level 2, and we're going to show this throughout the entire presentation here today, this is really one of the goals, is that the CMMC Level 2 and NIST 800-171 are actually pretty good at telling us what to do, right? And Jacob showed that in a presentation just before lunch. But it's absolutely not good at telling us how to do it, right? So the what is there, but the how is not. So how are we supposed to implement these requirements? Because we have to implement these requirements. How do we do it in a way that actually provides genuine security value? I'm going to demonstrate for you, by far, over the last 12 months or so, the most common attack chain that our team has executed against organizations in the defense industrial base to compromise their environment. And we're going to give an end-to-end explanation, steps 1 through 6, of exactly how that process works. And we're going to be mapping those to a MITRE ATT&CK techniques. And I appreciate that Jacob has already given everybody in here, I hope, a primer on what MITRE ATT&CK is. And then we're going to show kind of the parity between the mitigations published in MITRE's ATT&CK framework and the requirements that we have to do according to NIST. So something we need to keep in mind as we go out through this entire presentation is that none of these things, none of the vulnerabilities or the misconfigurations, things like that in general, are going to show up on your standard vulnerability scan. So everything that we're going to do is exploiting misconfigurations and abusing native functionality within a Windows environment to reach our goal, which is going to be to essentially compromise an internal network in an enterprise environment. So with that, let's go on the attack. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to be walking through the standard phases of a real compromise, or in my case, a penetration test. It's going to be an internal penetration test where we're working with an organization to identify and exploit weaknesses on their internal network. And we're splitting it into two broad areas. In the first step here, or the first couple phases, our goal is to obtain credentials and information. And then we're going to leverage those credentials to move laterally and escalate our privileges. And those are broken up into several phases, and within each one of those phases, we're going to execute several steps. Each one of those steps is well documented and understood if you looked back at the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And within each one of those steps, there are controls from NIST 800-171 that, had you implemented them from a security-focused perspective, we certainly could have mitigated the risk at every single one of these steps in the attack chain. So I'm not going to go through each and every step. We have, that's obviously the remainder of the presentation. All right, so phase one, the first step for a real attacker or a penetration testing team is to gather information. So from my perspective as a penetration tester, we are conducting an internal penetration test. So the assumption is, in this case, we're making one assumption. We have an internal network connection within your environment. That's all we have. We don't have any credentials. We don't know anything about anything. In the real world, from a hacking perspective, the corollary for this might be you have a compromised endpoint on your network already. Perhaps you have an insider threat, within your environment, or maybe even it's an example of unauthorized physical access where somebody is able to gain access to your facility and put something on your network. But like I said, we don't know anything about anything, so we need to start by gathering information in order to figure out how we're actually going to move forward. So we're going to start with discovery, which is one of the main or initial tactics within MITRE's attack framework. We're going to do system and network configuration discovery, which again is a published technique within MITRE's attack framework. Two steps fall into this bucket. We're going to start with network protocol abuse, and then we're going to perform a credential relay to Active Directory, and we'll dig into what those things mean. So obviously this is going to be a technical presentation. We're on the technical breakout. I will say one thing. I presented before here at CS2, and I've done deep dives into network protocol abuse because it's a really key step in our ability to obtain a set of credentials to actually facilitate the remainder of our test. So we're going to move really quickly through step one because I've done talks about this, and I'll link them here. You'll see which talks I'm actually talking about. And then we're going to dig in really deeply to the remaining steps. All right, so we're going to still talk about it, network protocol abuse. Again, all I have is a network connection. Right? I have literally just plugged into your network. Maybe I'm on the Wi-Fi. It's irrelevant at this point. But by passively listening on the network, I'm going to start gathering information. And the information that I'm trying to gather is to understand what protocols are in use within your environment, whether you know it or not. Right? So these are things that might be flying around on your network without you actually even knowing it. And the goal is to gain an adversary in the middle position. There are certain types of protocols that are in use in enterprise environments, whether that organization is aware of it or not, that can be abused for an adversary to gain what's called an adversary in the middle position, which means I'm positioning my system, that system that I placed on your network, or that compromised endpoint, between a standard user's system, or anybody's system, like a general user, and whatever destination that they're trying to reach. We're going to abuse that adversary in the middle position to obtain our first set of credentials on your network. And this is the corollary from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? We're leveraging our adversary in the middle position to gain credential access. So that I'm going to go through this kind of at a high level, and if you're interested, you can come talk to me, or you can look at these other presentations that I've already given at CS2. But common protocols that we are abusing to do this, right? DHCP v6. So this is the DHCP protocol for IPv6. So there's a mechanism for us to essentially assign IPv6 addresses to systems on your network. And if I can assign an IP address, I can control the DNS server. If I control the DNS server, I control all your traffic. So that's super technical and obviously really, really fast going through it. But I gave a deep dive on the specific topic, how we can leverage DHCP v6 to gain credentials on your network in Denver. Right, and that's available for anybody to go watch. Similarly, multicast name resolution, there are legacy protocols that are supported by default within a Windows environment, things like link local multicast name resolution, NetBIOS name service, multicast DNS. These are examples of name resolution protocols that go to everybody on the network. These requests for name resolution to translate an IP address into a name, or the other direction, a name into an IP address, those requests go to everybody on the network. So I can respond to those requests and thereby gain that adversary in the middle position. So normally we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail for every other step of this attack chain that we're going to execute. In this case, we're going to jump right to the mitigations and detections just because of time and because I've talked about these things before. So I do encourage you, if you're interested, to go take a look at those other talks. So mitigation, this is how it's going to work throughout this entire presentation. We're going to be looking at mitigations as published for this specific attack scenario, right? This is a specific technique. We're going to be looking at mitigations as published within MITRE's attack framework, and then trying to see if there's anything relevant, anything exists at all in the CMMC Level 2 framework or NIST 800-171 that is telling us to do the same thing. And what we're going to find is that MITRE is giving us a lot more detail on how to implement a requirement that already exists in NIST 800-171. So right here, this is an excellent example of the parity that we're going to see in certain cases where MITRE is telling us to do the exact same thing that 171 is already telling us to do. If there are protocols that are in use on your network that you don't know about or that we know can be abused, those are great examples of non-essential functionality, things that you don't need. And I've been in lots of environments, and I haven't yet found one that actually needed to support a business process. For example, those legacy name resolution protocols. So MITRE and NIST 800-171 are telling us the same thing. You should be disabling those things as part of your secure baseline. We're also going to be looking at detections, because you can't fix every problem, and every problem is never going to stay fixed forever. So being able to detect these things is also really, really important. And as we get further and further on our attack chain, we're going to see the detections become more important the further down this attack chain we get. I'm going to be pointing to this control over and over and over again from the CMMC requirements. It says, and I'm going to read it one time, monitor your systems, including inbound and outbound communications traffic, to detect attacks and indicators of potential compromise. That is an incredibly broad requirement. There is nothing in there that tells you how to do that effectively, obviously, right? And if you remember back to Jacob's presentation, this requirement from CMMC is directly mapped to SI4 from 853, which, if you remember, was the #1 control requirement at the top of his list of controls from 853 that address specific attack techniques within MITRE attack framework. So doing this control right, doing that specific CMMC requirement right, has been shown to address, according to his presentation, 350 different techniques within MITRE's attack framework. But there is not a lot of beef here, right? It doesn't tell you how to do it appropriately. So this is where we're going to start digging into MITRE's attack framework to look at what it means to do that control requirement appropriately, or to do it in a way that provides real security value. So this time, MITRE is telling us to monitor our network traffic specifically for anomalies that are associated with adversary in the middle behavior. And there's a lot of other resources out there for specifically what that means. But at this point, I've obtained an adversary in the middle position by abusing one of those protocols, right? We have 4 really, really standard options to gain that adversary in the middle position. Let's move on to step 2. In step 2, we have to figure out what we're going to do with that adversary in the middle position. I position myself between an end user and a destination, whatever destination they're trying to reach. It could be a file server, it could be a website, it could be anything like that. But we have to figure out how to abuse that position, that adversary in the middle position, to achieve the initial goal, which is gaining access to a set of credentials. So what we're going to do is abuse that position to poison specific requests, specifically the responses to those requests. So for example, I have gained an adversary in the middle position between a random user on your network and whatever destination they're trying to reach. It could be a website, example.company.com. And when I get that request, I'm the one that decides where to send you, right? I control DNS in this case. I can control where your computer is actually routed. And so I might not send you to example.company.com. And for very specific types of requests, we can simply prompt your machine, prompt your system for authentication in order to get to that destination. And if we're looking at the right requests and we've gained the right position, your machine will happily spit out some authentication material belonging to your user account automatically and transparently without you knowing about it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to poison very specific requests by abusing that position that we've gained and prompt your system for authentication, and it's going to give us your authentication material, a type of authentication material, automatically. And you're not going to know about this. So this is going to result in the disclosure of a hash, a password hash. This is an example of a net NTLM v2 hash. This is the type of hash that Windows will use when it's authenticating over a network. We have two options when we get a hash like this, right? This is a cryptographic representation of a password. It's not the password, but it's a cryptographic representation of that user's password, in this case, my password, from my little lab environment that I used to develop this presentation. So I have two options. I can try to crack that password, and we're always going to try to crack that password. Sometimes we can, take it offline. We'll load it into our fancy password cracking, system, and hopefully, maybe, we'll be able to essentially guess the password that was used to generate that hash. If we do that, we have access to the account. That's great. But that's not always successful, right? If the user has a long and complex password, or maybe it's a computer account, and we'll talk about that in a little while, it's going to be really hard or sometimes impossible to recover that password. So if there's a mechanism that I can actually leverage that authentication material as it is, right, without having to do any sort of offline password attack, anything like that, just use the hash as it is, that's incredibly valuable to me. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to relay that credential. And in this case, we're going to relay it to Active Directory directly. This is what that looks like. So in step one, we obtained this adversary in the middle position. We poisoned some responses, some very specific responses. We prompted that machine for authentication, and it just gave it to us, right? So now I have a hash. The moment that hash comes to me, I'm going to spit it right back out to the network and use it to authenticate directly to another service on the network. In this case, we're going to authenticate to LDAP, which is a service running on your Active Directory domain controller. And then I'm going to ask LDAP really nicely. I'm going to say, hello, Mr. Active Directory domain controller. I'm Scott. Would you please, pretty please, provide me with a list of all user accounts on the network, all computer accounts, every group member and every security group and all the members of those groups, rather, the network password policy, and if you have any information on services that are running at the domain level, at the network level, for example, Active Directory certificate services, and we're going to come back to that one, that's very important. If you have any of that information, could you please just hand it over? And then Active Directory is going to look at my hash, and it's going to come, do some cryptographic stuff in the background and check it against the hash that's stored in Active Directory and say, hey, you're Scott. You must, this is a valid password hash. And here you go. Here's all that information. So we've just executed, at a minimum, 2 more examples that are well-known attacker techniques as published by the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So we're doing account discovery, gathering a list of active user accounts on the network, and we know the password policy. And these are obviously well-documented techniques, and this will be really, really critical information for step 3. But before we move into that and what we're going to do with that information, let's look at some mitigations. So I really like this control from the CMMC requirements, actually. And I think the numbering is wrong because I was making changes late at night. So the control is important, the numbering is not. Employ replay-resistant authentication mechanisms for network access to different types of accounts, right? This is specifically calling out mitigating the attack that we just conducted. CMMC is telling us that we should be implementing a replay-resistant authentication. I'm not sure what replay resistance means. We should be moving towards replay proof, but there is a control requirement that speaks to it specifically. And if we look at the mitigation that's published by MITRE's attack framework for this specific type of attack, right, relays to Active Directory, it's going to tell us that we need to be protecting our domain controllers by ensuring that those specific systems are, hardened. Active Directory domain controllers are hardened. And if you're looking at an industry standard, for example, the Security Technical Implementation Guide, the STIG for Active Directory, it's going to tell you that you should have probably turned on LDAP signing, which would have prevented credential relay attacks to the LDAP service. And you should also turn on LDAP channel binding, which would have prevented my ability to relay credentials to LDAP-S, which is the secure version of the LDAP service. But you didn't do that because it's not turned on by default, and therefore I can relay credentials directly to LDAP without knowing what the password is, and essentially read Active Directory configuration data. I can get a list of users, I can get a list of computers, I can get a list of groups and things like that. Very valuable information for me at this stage of the penetration test. What about detections? CMMC told us that we should be monitoring our systems, and we should also be monitoring network traffic, and that's all they're going to tell us, right? Well, if we go back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework for this specific technique, it's going to tell us that we should be monitoring LDAP traffic specifically, and not just monitoring LDAP traffic, but looking for anomalous queries. And I'll tell you right now that when I make a query against Active Directory in an enterprise environment, against LDAP specifically, and I ask for a list of every single user and every single computer and all the stuff that I already went through, that's a massive LDAP query. And it is absolutely anomalous. It will stand out. So MITRE's ATT&CK framework is giving us really detailed information that could help us to implement that requirement from the CMMC framework in a way that provides real security value. All right, we're moving into phase 2. I have done information gathering, right? I have collected some information, I have relayed a hash to Active Directory, and I have got a lot of information about the configuration of your environment, the users, and things like that. So without knowledge of a single user's password, which is key, I don't know any passwords yet, I got a bunch of hashes, so let's not forget about that. I always had the opportunity to try to crack those hashes and potentially get a password back. A list of Active Directory user accounts, the password policy, information about all the services on the domain, hopefully including ADCS, which is Active Directory Certificate Services. And now we need to, well, at least the goal of this step is going to be to recover direct access to a valid user account. And that means I want to know what the plaintext password is. So what we're going to do is execute 2 more techniques from MITRE's ATT&CK framework, because what we want to do is gain our initial access to a pre-existing valid account on the network by performing a type of brute force password attack. And we have all the information that we need to do that now, that we gathered in steps 1 and 2. So what does that look like? If I have all this information right here, every username corresponding to an active account, I know what the minimum password length is, I know what the account lockout policy is, and I know when everybody last changed their password. All that information I got from Active Directory when I relayed those credentials to LDAP. I have everything I need to go forth and hack. So this is what it looks like in certain cases. This is a really good example of some of the things that we're going to try. We're going to perform what's called a password spray attack. It's not technically a brute force attack. A brute force attack, that's when you pick one account and try 1,000 passwords against it. See if you can get lucky. Password spray is exactly the opposite. We pick a small list of passwords, and we try them against every single account in your environment. And because I know what the account lockout policy is, I can do so, hopefully, without locking out any accounts. And because I know what the minimum password length is, I can tailor some of these examples here to make sure that the passwords that I'm trying at least meet your technical password policy. So we'll start with some really bad passwords, because users, password 123, bang, maybe we get lucky with that one. Spring 2024, exclamation mark, that's a really good example. And because I know when everybody changed their last password, for example, your organization might require changing passwords every 90 days. Well, I can look through the information that I received from Active Directory, and I can see that everybody in your environment changed their password in November of last year. So instead, that one's going to say winter 2023, bang. Just a very common thing that users choose. Ask me how I know. Welcome one. That's a really common one that help desk, things like that might do for temporary passwords when somebody's being onboarded. Company name, one bang. We're going to tailor our attacks always to the companies that we're attacking, or working with, rather. That's something that we find all the time. And then we're going to get to some other examples where it's really not dependent on choosing the appropriate password. It's about abusing misconfigurations or just poor password hygiene overall. So things like a blank password. You'd be surprised how many times we have found at least one account within an enterprise environment that accepts a blank password. It just happens. It's technical debt. An account gets created automatically when we spin up a service or who knows what, but it happens more than you might think. What about the description field? in Active Directory. When we extract the information from Active Directory, every user account, almost every object in Active Directory really, but specifically every user account has a description field. People use that to put in the department, maybe, where that person works, maybe their title. Sometimes people put passwords in the description field. So we'll go through that for every single account and make sure that we haven't overlooked a plain text password simply stored in the description field in Active Directory. How about username equals password? So we'll take the username, because we know a list of every single username, and we'll try that same username as the password for that account. And you might think to yourself, well, Microsoft's complexity rules should prevent that from happening, and that's true, right? But most organizations have technical debt, and that means we have accounts that have been around for a long time, maybe longer than when you first click that button to implement those complexity requirements. So we find this all the time. Username equals password, that's always something that's always on our list of things to check against every single account. And then finally, as one might expect, we will go out and collect compromised credentials from every publicly available breach that's out there already and see if we can get lucky with any previously compromised credentials. So let's look at an example of this really quickly. There are tools out there, and we're going to be showing examples of tools throughout this entire presentation that make this stuff ridiculously easy. I make a user list. This is in my little lab. I have 6 users, I think. And so I just make a little text file with all the names of the users. And then I'm going to fire up a tool called Metasploit. This is our chosen tool for doing this specific type of attack. And that's because this tool supports some configuration options that make it a little safer, because I'm a penetration tester, not a hacker. So right up at the top, set abort on lockout to true. A hacker's never going to do this, but if I do happen to lock an account by accident, we're going to stop the attack right then, so I can kind of work through that with the organization, because our goal is never to cause any undue impact to the network. And then we're going to set user as pass equals true. So that means that configuration option is going to tell this tool automatically, try to log into every single account with its own name as the password. And then I'm going to set the user file. I'm going to feed that little list of users into the tool, set a couple more configuration options. For example, what system am I trying to authenticate against? In this case, it's a domain controller, which is always a good option. Feed it a couple more pieces of information, and then hit go. And we sit there and just watch and wait for that little green check mark rather, or the plus sign, to fly past on the screen. Because if we see a little green plus sign right there, that means that we have successfully authenticated to an account. One thing to keep in mind is that I don't care which account I've authenticated to. It is irrelevant at this stage of the attack which account I have broken into, for lack of a better term. We just want access to an account. It becomes more important later on which accounts we're looking at, but right now, I just want to see that little green check mark. So how do we mitigate this type of attack? Well, again, this is one of probably the only other example where we have almost perfect parity between the requirements of CMMC and the published mitigation for this specific type of attacker technique, and that's the use of multi-factor authentication. That's one of the only ways that we can address the inherent weaknesses of using passwords. So we're bound to using passwords, for now at least. Multi-factor authentication becomes essentially one of the only ways to mitigate the inherent weaknesses of using that as your authentication scheme. And detection. Detection is becoming more and more important, and we'll show you why the further we get. But for detection here, we're going back to the same CMMC requirement. There's only one, right? There really is only one requirement that speaks to what we're trying to talk about here, which is detecting indicators of compromise, detecting attacks. CMMC said you should be monitoring your systems and your traffic. Do it like I told you to. And you say, how do I do that? What am I monitoring for? MITRE's attack framework will say you should monitor for lots of failed attempts to access various accounts on the network, because that's a password spray. I might authenticate, or fail to authenticate rather, to hundreds of accounts in a network before I see that little green that little green plus sign. So if you're not monitoring for failed authentications across a lot of accounts in a very short period of time, you might not see this activity. But again, we're getting really good feedback from MITRE's attack framework on how to implement a CMMC requirement that we're all bound to. All right, we're moving into the third phase. And this is important because we have a set of credentials, but it's just one set of user credentials. And one thing I will say is that we were not entirely in control of the attack chain up until now. We relied on a little bit of luck in a couple different steps, being in the right place at the right time, things like that. From this point forward, we are 100% in control of what's going to happen next. We're executing specific techniques against specific systems, abusing very specific misconfigurations, and there's no more luck involved here. We are in control of this attack chain from now on. So we're going to talk about now what we can do with one set of user credentials. Remember what we've got so far, right? We have some information from Active Directory, and we have one user account. And I told you already, it does not matter whose account it is. It's a valid account on the network. That's all that matters. So that's not a lot. We do not have a lot, right? And that can take us quite a while to get to there sometimes. But this part moves really, really quickly. So we've talked a lot about how, all the things that it took for us to get here. But what we're going to talk about now can be executed, given specific configurations in your environment by any valid account on your network. There are no prerequisites. Valid authentication is the prerequisite from here on out. So think about that as we move forward. We are going to move forward with lateral movement and privilege escalation by abusing a Windows feature combined with the exploitation of a really common configuration weakness in Active Directory Certificate Services. Active Directory Certificate Services in red, because it's really important. It's a very critical system on your network, even if you didn't know it, and we're going to demonstrate why. All right, so steps 4 and 5 fall into lateral movement. We're going to force a system to authenticate, and then we're going to do another credential relay attack. And we're going to dig into both of those. So let's take a look. Authentication coercion. It turns out that if you ask a system, nicely enough, in the right format, using the right protocols, any valid account within a Windows environment can be used to force Windows servers to authenticate to arbitrary other systems on the network. So if I'm an attacker and I'm on your network and I have a valid account, I can force systems on the network to authenticate to me, the system that I have on your network. And this is going to result in the disclosure of the exact same type of hash that we just saw in step 2, a net NTLM v2 password hash, which is the format of a password hash that's sent over the network. But this time, it's not a user account that we're looking for. In fact, we're not even targeting a user account at this point. This password hash belongs to the computer account. So computers have identities too within Active Directory. That means computers have passwords. That means computers can authenticate using a password. And if we steal that over the network, what we obtain is a password hash in the same exact format that we saw before, but this time it belongs to the computer. So if we're choosing the right target and being very specific about what we're trying to do, we can force a high-value, highly privileged target to authenticate back to us and disclose a password hash for a very highly privileged machine instead of a user. That would be your domain controller in this case. So we're going to be executing, at a minimum, 2 more techniques from MITRE's attack framework. We are going to execute native remote procedure calls within Windows, which is a form of API, in order to obtain a set of credentials by forcing a system to authenticate. Well-documented, well-known techniques within MITRE's attack framework. What does this look like? I'm using a tool called Coercion. I like this tool because it knows every single way that a system can be forced to authenticate. There are various remote procedure calls that can be used to do this. And this is a well-known thing that is just a feature. This is how it's supposed to work, is what we have been told. So I'm going to authenticate to your domain controller. As you can see up at the top, I know it's probably hard to see, but I'm telling that system, that the domain controller, that's my target. I'm giving it a valid user account, the same account that I compromised in the previous step that is using a username of Scott and a password of Scott, which is really bad. Feeding it a couple more configuration options. So I'm authenticating to that system, and I'm telling it, please force that domain controller to authenticate back to me. And it's going to run through all the various remote procedure calls that can be abused to force a system to authenticate. And then eventually, I should receive yet another net NTLM v2 hash. This time, if you look at line 2, I think it is, the second line right there, SMB username, scott.lab/scott-dc $. That's a computer account. That's the computer account that belongs to the domain controller. Now I have to figure out what to do with that hash, but before we get there, how do we mitigate this problem? Well, we'll talk about a couple options, but I will say that Microsoft is aware of this weakness. I would call it a vulnerability because I exploit it all the time, but Microsoft is not going to fix these for you. This is not a problem that we can patch away. This is not a problem that will ever appear on your vulnerability scan because you forgot to apply a patch. Microsoft will only fix these types of problems, being able to force a system to authenticate, if it doesn't require authentication. So if I can do this without providing a username and password, that's something that Microsoft will address, but they have come out and said, no, that's what those remote procedure calls are for. So we're going to continue to abuse this unless an organization has either mitigated it or has detections for it and therefore can identify that we're doing it and stop us from doing it. So the control that I've chosen to point to here is from the System and Communications Protection domain, which says we should be denying network communications traffic by default and allowing it by exception, right? We all know this control probably, and what I see organizations doing when they're implementing this requirement is treating this as a perimeter control, right? I'm compliant if I have a default deny rule on my perimeter firewalls. That might be true, right? You might be compliant. I'm not going to talk about compliance, but you're not mitigating this risk if you're treating this control as a perimeter control. So if we dig in a little bit deeper, MITRE will tell us that we should filter network traffic between network boundaries. And there are other requirements from CMMC that make us define what our key internal boundaries are. So maybe we should be considering the boundary between our workstations and our end users and our critical tier 0 assets, like domain controllers, as a key internal boundary. And maybe perform some filtering there so a system can't authenticate outbound, because it's really rare that a domain controller would ever have to authenticate directly to a workstation. Because Microsoft is not going to fix this for you. This is an example of where detection becomes really valuable, right? There are ways to mitigate the risk. There are technical things you can do, certainly RPC filters and things like that. We can do those things. But a lot of people will choose, I imagine, to detect instead because we can detect these types of things and it's not necessarily a simple thing to fix. CMMC has already told us that we should be monitoring all of our things, right? They don't tell us how to do it. So MITRE's attack framework, again, we've already looked at this one back when we were talking about the LDAP service. The same detection is telling us that we should also be monitoring Microsoft remote procedure calls because it's known to be abused by bad guys and pen testers to perform things like authentication coercion or forced authentication. So again, MITRE is showing us specifically how we can implement a detection that will also push us forward on our compliance journey for that requirement. All right, now I need to figure out what to do with that with that password hash. So before, I had two options. I could crack that hash, or I could try, or I could relay it. And I'll tell you right now, we're not going to crack that hash. The machine itself manages its own password. It's something like 120 characters long. It's not going to be cracked. So we're not going to try. That means if we're going to do something like this, we had better have a target to relay that password to, or that hash rather, that authentication material. We need to relay that authentication material somewhere in order to be able to use it for anything. And you'll hear me using the term authentication material a lot from now on, because we're going to go through a couple different types of authentication material, and none of them are passwords. So from this point forward, we're going to be abusing and leveraging all the different ways that systems and users can authenticate in a standard Windows environment. And we're never going to talk about a password from here on out. The first one we'll talk about is certificate enrollment. I want to introduce everybody here to what I consider, based on my experience over the last 12 months, the broadest attack surface on your network that you might never have thought about before. And that's Active Directory Certificate Services, ADCS. This is an incredibly broad attack surface because, well, there's a lot of different ways to abuse it, number one. But number two, if I asked most people in the room, what is your primary on-premise identity provider? Everybody is probably going to point to Active Directory. Of course I have an enterprise identity provider, it's Active Directory. And the truth is, if you've spun up Active Directory certificate services, you have another identity provider on your network, whether you knew it or not, that is removed and divorced from Active Directory to a really significant extent. ADCS is an identity provider, and we're going to show you what that means today and how it can be abused. But essentially, that means that I can obtain authentication material directly from ADCS without involving Active Directory at all. And that makes it really valuable for me. People don't generally treat this like an identity provider. They don't treat it like a critical asset, at least in the organizations that I've worked with recently. And therefore, they're certainly not monitoring it, which makes this a really valuable target for us. So what we're going to do next is perform lateral movement by calling some remote services, and it's a specific service that is running on Active Directory certificate services, in order to forge, or rather enroll a fraudulent certificate, which will give me access to even more authentication material. And it's still not a password. What does this look like? In the previous step, I forced the domain controller to authenticate to me. So I have its hash. That's the first several characters of its password hash. That is a cryptographic representation of its password. It's not its password. And I will not be able to crack it, so I had better have a place to relay it to. So this is a good exercise. If you have spun up ADCS, Active Directory Certificate Services, or you're not sure if you have, figure that out first, and then go navigate to it in a browser. Go http://name of your certificate authority server /certserve/certfinish.asp. If you are prompted for authentication with a little basic authentication prompt like that, that means that your organization supports web enrollment. So certificate web enrollment. It gives you a little terrible web application for enrolling certificates and managing certificates. And this is not on by default. It's an option when you're installing or installing the role, the Active Directory Certificate Services role. It's an option to choose whether this is on or off. In a lot of environments, it's turned on because humans like a GUI. But the problem is, in its default configuration, web enrollment is vulnerable to relay attacks, just like the LDAP service was back in step 2. And that means I can relay, this time, a domain controller's password hash directly to that path on your Active Directory Certificate Services server and obtain a certificate. This is really important. That certificate, that long string of text at the bottom, you're not meant to be able to understand what it is because it's base 64 encoded certificate stuff. However, that certificate is valid for authentication on behalf of the domain controller. So if I'm able to enroll a certificate by relaying credentials, I can obtain a certificate back from Active Directory Certificate Services that is natively authentication material. So I still don't know what the password for that account is. All I did was relay a password hash, and I've obtained the ability to authenticate on behalf of that domain controller. And that sounds bad, I hope, because it is, and we'll talk about what we're going to do with that certificate next. Before we get there, how would you ever prevent this from happening? How would we mitigate this? There is one control requirement from the CMMC framework that tells you what to do, but it certainly doesn't tell you how to do it. We need to establish and manage cryptographic keys that we're using in our systems. ADCS is a certificate authority by its very nature. It is supporting PKI, public key infrastructure. It's all about cryptographic keys, right? Public and private keys, that's, the whole process of enrolling a certificate revolves around cryptographic keys. So this is part of your scope for that control, if you have it. It has to be. But it's not telling us how to manage those keys or how they should be established or how to secure the CA itself, the certificate authority. But MITRE ATT&CK framework really gets into the weeds on this one, and it's telling us, if we skip past the very beginning of it, we need to treat our certificate authorities as tier 0 assets. That means treat them as the highest risk, most critical systems in your environment. It's a tier that is usually reserved for things like Active Directory domain controllers themselves. And further than that, it's telling us to go out and identify how those services can be abused and harden that system against those known techniques. And right now, there are no less than 12 different ways of abusing Active Directory certificate services to obtain elevated permissions. We've only talked about one. So that's an excellent example of, from mitigation perspective, how MITRE's attack framework is kind of pushing us forward when we're met with a control requirement that is incredibly broad and short and difficult to interpret, while MITRE is giving us really detailed guidance. And again, that's guidance that is directly applicable to a known attacker technique and one that my team uses all the time. What about monitoring, or detection rather? CMMC, why aren't you monitoring yet? I already told you to monitor your systems. But MITRE's attack framework, for this specific one, will say, have you actually validated that your certificate authority is even doing audit logging in the first place? People spend tons of time and money and effort in hardening Active Directory, and we just learned that we should be treating our CAs as a tier 0 asset, just like our domain controllers. So we should probably go enable auditing, and we should probably monitor ADCS for signs of abuse. Here's a really good example of a sign of abuse: a random new domain controller certificate being enrolled. Did you spin up a new domain controller? Like, that's absolutely an anomaly that can be detected, right, is enrolling a brand new domain controller certificate. All right, so what do we have now? We have a certificate. It's not just any certificate, it's the domain controller certificate. That means it's valid for authentication on behalf of the DC. And what does that mean? In practice, that means that I can impersonate anybody. I haven't quite compromised the domain controller yet, but I am the domain controller at this point. As far as your network is concerned, I am the domain controller. So at this point, we're going to recover yet another type of authentication material. And that authentication material this time is going to be a Kerberos ticket. It's another authentication mechanism within a standard enterprise Windows environment. So we're going to gain access to yet another type of credential material by forging a Kerberos ticket, which will allow us to impersonate valid accounts on your network. And this time, obviously, I'm going to choose a highly privileged account, like a domain admin. So we can use that certificate, the resulting ticket, the Kerberos ticket, to do whatever we want on your network. And the example that we're going to give is by pulling passwords directly out of Active Directory. So this is kind of boring because it's just a lot of text on the screen, but this is the tool that we're going to use. It's called Rubius. We'll make a request for a ticket. We will receive the ticket because I have a valid domain controller cert. That means I can authenticate successfully as the DC. I will retrieve a ticket from the Kerberos service, and then I can use that ticket to pull very sensitive information out of Active Directory. And the sensitive information that we are pulling out of Active Directory is the NTLM hash of the domain administrator's password account, rather. And the beauty, or rather another kind of Windows feature, is that those passwords, that hash right there, that NTLM hash, that's not the same type of hash that we saw earlier. It's much shorter, right? And it looks completely different. That's the format of a hash that's stored on disk. So within Active Directory, passwords are stored in that format. It's an NTLM hash. And those hashes can be used in place of a password. I don't need to try to crack it. I can simply use that hash to authenticate to the admin account, and that's just the way that Windows is architected. So now I have essentially taken over the environment entirely. So this is the point of the discussion here where detections become a lot more critical. Because if I have the certificate and I have the ability to authenticate successfully to Kerberos and get a ticket and things like that, there's nothing really that you can do to stop me, right? I have all the authentication material and the information that I need to do these things. So if we had implemented some of these requirements way earlier in our attack chain, it would have made it a lot harder for me to get here, but that doesn't mean it would have stopped me necessarily, so detections are going to become really important. However, we have a really broad requirement to do access controls within CMMC, limit information system access to the types of transactions and functions that users are permitted to execute. MITRE will take it one step further. We should be segregating our domain admin accounts from our server admin accounts, and further, segregating both of those types of accounts from our workstation admin accounts. This comes back to the idea of a tier 0 asset, basically categorizing our assets based on risk. Tier 0 assets are only accessed by domain admins. Tier 1 assets are only accessed by server admins. And Tier 2 assets, those are accessed by workstation admins and obviously end users as well. But like I said, it's really hard to stop me if I have everything that I've gotten so far. We're all the way at step 6. So in certain situations, a detection is all that we can do. Pretty sure I told you should be monitoring already from the CMMC framework, obviously. That's all we have to go off of, is that one requirement from the CMMC framework. But MITRE's attack framework will really dig into how to do really effective monitoring around Kerberos activity. So there's a number of examples here, and I'll tell you from experience that the types of requests that I am making on a penetration test and the types of requests that real threat actors are making, they fall into these categories of these examples, right? RC4 encryption, things like that. This is really good guidance on how to do effective Kerberos monitoring. All right. So we just took over an environment, and it was a lot, and it was really technical. I appreciate that no one got up and left, but let's talk about how we got here. We just took over that environment with knowledge of one user's password, just a regular old user, and if I'm honest, we didn't actually need that password. There are ways to execute this whole attack chain relying on relays only, but we did it with one user's password, one user, general user. We did it without exploiting a single software-level vulnerability that exists due to a missing patch, right? And finally, we did it while exclusively leveraging native Microsoft Windows functionality and all the various authentication material and mechanisms that are available to us, and configuration weaknesses. That's what we did. We abused configuration weaknesses. To me, this means that secure baselines are as important as your patching strategy and your traditional vulnerability management strategy. Because this attack chain is two things. One, the entire attack chain is absent from your vulnerability scan results, like I already said, right? So if your vulnerability management strategy is entirely dependent on scanning systems for missing patches, you're not going to see any of these weaknesses. And two, it's the most common way that my team is currently compromising organizations in the defense industrial base. But what I hope we've shown is that actually 800.171 is actually, it's not bad at telling us what to do, right? The requirements are actually speaking to the exact techniques that I'm using on a daily basis during our penetration tests, but we need to accept the fact that NIST 800.171 is never going to tell us how to do it, how to implement those controls appropriately. So next steps. I would say, honestly, based on my experiences in the past year or so, if you have deployed ADCS, I would probably stop and go see if you've implemented it. And then if you have, we need to take some action in the short term to harden it against the known mechanisms by which it can be abused, and start thinking about implementing a monitoring strategy for that system, because it is an identity provider, very similar to how we were probably treating Active Directory. We could be working with our security teams to figure out, are we even capable of detecting or mitigating any of the things that we talked about here today? Because all we're doing is abusing native functionality and misconfigurations. If you're on the blue team or the red team, you can go out here and do it yourself, right? Test these things out in your environment with authorization. And my final slide here, I'll give you a list of the tools that we use to do this, right? These are all commodity open source software tools. There's nothing voodoo or brand new or magic about what we're doing. And finally, and this comes back to Jacob's presentation, consider leveraging MITRE's attack framework to figure out how to implement that one requirement that Jacob talked about, SI4, which the same control requirement appears, or a similar control requirement appears in 800.171, and it just says do monitoring. MITRE will tell you how to do that in a way that's actually really, really effective. And if you're taking a security-focused approach to your compliance journey, you should be getting compliant as a side effect of doing these requirements. If you're going to spend the time and money and all that effort to get compliant, you might as well get security as a side effect of that. All right, so here's a list of the tools. Every step, these slides should be available if anybody's really interested in figuring out how it works. And I will open it up for questions. Sure.
So you stated about how CMMC does a really good job at stating what, but not the how, and how with using the MITRE attack framework and everything else, it really helps you guys to be able to get into systems and install those exploits and stuff like that. But that's a lot for a smaller company or something like that. That's a lot of legwork for an IT administrator to do. So what is your thoughts on those organizations such as CIS with their benchmarks or DISA with their STIGs as being able to show you what you need to do in order to thwart those attacks?
That's an excellent question. I would never suggest to anybody rolling your own secure configuration baseline. That work has been done, and it's been done, and it's being done on an ongoing basis by people who are a lot smarter than me, right? So STIGs, Security Technical Implementation Guides, published by DISA, the CIS benchmarks, those are really good examples of secure baselines that will natively address a number of the of the steps in here. So CIS benchmark will absolutely tell you to enable LDAP signing, right? Preventing our ability to relay to LDAP. The STIG will take it further than that, tell you to implement LDAP channel binding, which will completely cut off our ability to relay to LDAP at all. I have been inside, or I've worked with organizations who have a really, really strong and formal and well-oiled patching strategy as far as vulnerability management is concerned, and it plays very little part in our attack chain, how good you are at patching. If there's vulnerabilities out there that are due to missing patches and stuff like that that are exploitable, we'll exploit them. But in the absence of those types of vulnerabilities, which means you're doing a really great job at vulnerability management, right, the what, we always have techniques like this to abuse misconfigurations. And the best thing that we can do is stand on the shoulders of other giants, whether it's MITRE ATT&CK, which is a lot of work, I get it, or STIGs, right? CIS benchmark is a great alternative. There's not a STIG for every single piece of software, right, that's out there, but it's an excellent starting point. Absolutely excellent starting point. If you're going through your GPOs and you're deciding on your own which buttons to click and things like that, you're already doing too much work, in my opinion, because the STIG will get you a lot farther.
Anyone else? Last few minutes for questions in the room. Yes, sir.
In 2021, MITRE, their threat-informed defense, released a report and an Azure mapping from the MITRE ATT&CK framework to the Azure IaaS system and their capabilities. Do you have any experience looking at that in correlation to this talk here?
Sure. Absolutely. We perform most environments nowadays, not all, obviously, but a significant number or portion of these environments, especially within the defense industrial base, are hybrid, where we have some on-premise infrastructure and some, normally Azure government infrastructure, but not always. I gave a talk in Huntsville, I think it was, that was purely focused on attack techniques for a cloud environment, end-to-end. And every single thing that was in that talk, it's very similar to this one, but except that it was focused only on cloud techniques, abuse of native services up in Azure government and bypassing multi-factor authentication, all these different types of things. Every single one of those things is present in, is accounted for by MITRE's attack framework. They are agnostic. Every technique that's in this framework, every mitigation is agnostic of technology, and the detection, all the recommendations that they're giving are not dependent on which operating system you're using or whether you're cloud or whether you're local. So that's actually probably a pretty good resource when it comes to the offensive security side of cloud security. But every single thing that was in that presentation, all the normal things that we would do and all the easy kind of ways of compromising the cloud environment, they mapped directly back to MITRE's attack framework as well, and some of the same stuff we looked at here today. Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So, a question for you. A lot of what you did, I should say, not everything, relied on NTLM. But NTLM is, you can't be running that and be compliant with the avoid replay resistant authentication. So if our NTLM is turned off, hopefully by the baseline, I haven't actually checked the CIS baseline to see if they turn it off, but would you still be able to succeed?
Couple points. Replay resistance can be achieved in two ways. You can eliminate the use of protocols that can be relayed, like NTLM, which is, a big swing for a lot of organizations, disabling NTLM. Alternatively, you can eliminate the presence of relay targets on your network. So the use of a protocol like NTLM or NET NTLM v2, if there are no targets in your environment, for example, SMB, if you enable SMB signing everywhere, that eliminates the ability for an attacker to relay those credentials to SMB. If you do what I told you to do for LDAP, I can't relay to LDAP. If you do what I talked about for ADCS, I can't relay to ADCS. So we're approaching it from the other aspect, which is when we go into an environment, what we are doing is first, find every relay target that is available to us, because the assumption is that NTLM is still available, because it is in most organizations. So our recommendations are based around eliminating the ability for relays to even take place in an environment, and there is not a endpoint or service that I'm aware of, at least, that cannot be hardened against relay attacks. There's RPC supports integrity checks now, and there's a lot more advancements that have come forth. And even if, I hate to say this, but even if you've disabled NTLM in an environment, the standard replacement for that would be Kerberos in most organizations. We can relay Kerberos authentication. So that's just the way it is. I mean, the number of targets that are available to us to do that are much more limited, but I'm not aware of a replay proof authentication mechanism yet, so.
An interesting note on configurations that you said, Ken, where you're like, well, NTLM won't be there if your configurations are set up properly. We didn't talk about it in the previous session, but the second most mapped to control is CMMC, which is configuration settings. So you're monitoring and you have set a configuration baseline, which is basically exactly what he's saying here. Like, if things are set and you're watching, then you'll probably see them. So yeah, we can talk after and talk about how most of the configuration management controls are actually pretty high up towards the top to do exactly what you're saying. We had a question come in here, probably the last one if there aren't any more in the room. Pen test specific. They say, is the PTES still a great framework for pen testing? It hasn't been updated for a while now. Great talk. Thank you.
So PTES as a methodology is not outdated by any means, I would say. I mean, the methodologies that are available are meant to be extensible. And any time you're looking at a methodology that's incredibly, incredibly detailed, it becomes stale really quickly. So these higher level methodologies like PTES actually provide real value because it's kind of a framework against which you can build out your actual process for penetration testing. So I don't think it's outdated.
There was a quick follow-up from Schmakeup Schmorn. What does PTES stand for? Schmakeup says. Penetration
testing ethical standard or something like that.
Great.
I'm sure that's incorrect. It's a standard. It's a methodology.
Gotcha. Okay, last one here, and then we'll break.
Execution standard.
Hi. What do you recommend for internal network monitoring?
Well, that's a great question. So without, I'm not affiliated or, tied to any brands or vendors or things like that, but I have seen real value, or I should actually come at this from the other direction. I have trouble executing penetration tests effectively, and for me, that means, doing what I showed you here today, in organizations that are doing network level monitoring. So there is a system that is eating packets, right? Network packets, because if you're looking at logs on a system, which is what a lot of, network, well, I call it network monitoring, but monitoring solutions are doing, those logs are generated after something bad has happened. So tools that are either operating at both of those tiers or specifically operating at the network level, that means that they're consuming NetFlow logs or packets, right? They're actually looking at traffic as it's occurring, east to west, north to south. They're seeing what's happening in as near real time as there can be, and there's solutions out there that can make decisions based on what they're seeing, which will prevent me from doing something before I can do it, not after.
All right, everybody, Scott Goodwin.